This is our third in the series on George Grant, and particularly using the image of the owl and JADIS. This part 3 is going to look at George Grant and Jerusalem, the dilemma of biblical Judaism. When we think of Judaism, I'm not obviously dealing with the post-biblical phase of the diaspora or the mystical type that we find in the Hasidic or Kabbalistic or post-Holocaust. We're looking at the dilemmas of biblical Judaism. One of the problems we face in the modern world is a high level of illiteracy. And that is, most people just have no sense of understanding of these great classical texts which have formed civilization and Western heritage in much of the world. And the conservatives, as opposed to many modern and postmodern types, are trying to get back to these classical texts as an attempt to say, we've lost our way in modernity, there's fragmentation, people are going in all directions. If we can get back to some solid classical texts, we'll re-engage, we'll revive the Western culture. We have a problem with this, though, in thinking of this, and George Grant grappled with this in his work on biblical Judaism. There are three tendencies within the biblical tradition, and when there's one approach, of course, to reading the Bible, it's devotional, you don't raise critical questions of it, but that creates its own intellectual dilemma and problems. People just end up repressing tough questions. But the three issues that collide with one another, and they're polyphonic, i.e. there's different voices at work in the Jewish tradition, which so when one enters in, it's not a mathematical formula. This is what the Jewish tradition is, and there is no tensions and clashes within it. So the one position is that God is one of will. God is one of action. God is one who does. I am who I am. God chooses, and God's choice is de facto right because God made the choice. So God chooses Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. The people are chosen, they're given land. There's this link between people and land. They go in, and certainly in books like Deuteronomy, they go in and commit genocide of people. You get Joshua engaged in the same genocidal activity. So here you have one is a God who wills, who chooses, and because God chooses and God is God, therefore the decisions are de facto right decisions. But is God good? What's the relationship of will and goodness? The other element in biblical Judaism is that God is a God of justice, God is a God of peace, God is a God who is concerned with the Jewish people he has chosen, also concerned with the outsider, the foreigner, the marginalized, people from other races, backgrounds. So in that sense, he's not a tribal God. An ethnic God transcends that ethnicity. So here you have a tension on the one hand between a God who wills and chooses, who transcends goodness, transcends good and evil at times, and a God who is good, and so will become subordinate to good. The third tradition is in one sense, it's a moral cause and effect tradition for the people, the Jewish people. If you live this way with integrity, obey me, follow my commands, do what's expected, good will follow. The weather will be good, the crops will go, the children will be healthy. In one sense, it's an early health and wealth prosperity gospel. Now the problem, of course, with that sort of moral cause and effect approach is that many of the best people in the world, those who live the good life in the noblest sense of that, are the ones who are punished, they die, they're executed. And so that moral formula just does not work in an empirical sense, and it creates dilemmas for people who grow up in that and take it in with their mother's milk, as it were. If you live a good life, I won't experience tragedy, suffering. God will be with me and take me through positive times. Now these three traditions then, if we can call them the willing God, the good God, and then the God, if who is obeyed, good happens, there's a collision in the Bible on this. And George Grant and following writers such as Simon Weil were acutely aware of this, that on the one hand there seems to be a warrior God, the God who wills, who chooses people to act unjustly. So on the one hand we're told not to kill, and yet told to kill other people. And so these dilemmas become very pronounced in terms of the Jewish tradition, and they collide in large elements of biblical tradition. Hence the violence of God in the Old Testament, and then also the other hand, the justice and peacemaking side. So which God are we going to heed, and why. And so when George Grant explores biblical Judaism, not only following Simon Weil and others, these are the troubling questions that have to be asked when we turn to the ancient ways and realize that there is conflicts and polyphony. So whose version of God are we going to listen to? And this is part of Grant's grappling with the whole metaphor of Jerusalem.